Hello everyone, I'm Marine Lefort and I'm a freelance editor and you listen to Les Voix de la Photo. Les Voix de la Photo is the podcast that gives voice to professionals in the photo and image field to reveal their journeys, their successes, sometimes their setbacks and give us some advice along the way. Today, this episode is in English because I'm with Charlotte Kent. Hello Charlotte.
Hello.
You are an arts writer and associate professor of visual culture at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Your expertise lies in the realms of the 20th century and 21st century arts, digital culture, and emerging technologies. Your work is characterized by a keen focus on contextualizing the subjects within the broader historical and ecological landscape of culture and politics. You are also the co-editor of the forthcoming book Contemporary Absurdities, Existential Crises and Visual Art, to be published by Intellect Books. Additionally, you serve as editor-at-large, contributing a monthly column on art and technology for the Brooklyn Rail. And you write in culture magazine, academic journals, books, and exhibition catalogs. Your influence extends beyond the writing world. Last year, you moderated a panel discussion at Paris Photo, exploring the intersection of conceptual art and computer photography in the area of artificial intelligence. During this conversation, I would like us to talk about your career and your projects, but also about photography through your prism as a specialist in digital culture and emerging technologies. To begin this interview, could you introduce us to the environment in which you grew up? Were your family or friends interested in the arts? Where did you grow up?
I'm an American, and my parents met in Berlin in the 1970s. My father worked for the State Department, so he was a diplomat. My mother was a film critic. And so in that sense, my father was a cultural attaché, so he was interested in how the arts and culture, music, all of these things contribute to international relations. And my mother had been a part of the art scene in Berlin, went to galleries, and was a film critic. They separated. I grew up in Eastern Europe with my father. That's where he was stationed. So just on the, mentioning of photography, like from a very, very early age, photography was always a very sort of dangerous thing. Like there's places you can't photograph when you're in an embassy, right? And so that was something I knew before I knew it, that you take pictures and sometimes you can't take a picture, and sometimes pictures have dangerous information in them, and sometimes you have to be sneaky about photographs. And so there's just this whole world of sort of that happening at the same time that as a child, you're taking photos for birthday parties and you're taking photos to send to grandparents. So that was really, I think, in retrospect, actually quite formative. I then moved back to the States, lived with my mother in New York. She was very involved in the art scene.
At what age?
When I was 10 years old. So the wall had come down. So now we're dealing with the 90s. And I actually got very involved in theater, where, you have lots of different types of arts getting involved, sort of mixing it up. And maybe in some ways because of, I went to museums a lot as a child. In my early teens, I would go to museums to get away from family and to get away from stress. And I was free to go and look on my own. So there was no one with me. There was no guide. So I would just walk around the museum and I would stop and I would look at something.
Which kind of art? Like it was more...
I didn't really, it wasn't art historical yet. It was really just, in Washington, D.C., there's the Smithsonian Museums, and they are all free. There's Asian art, there's modern art, there's portraits, there's historical works, there's sculpture, right? And when I was in Washington, D.C., I would just go to the museums. You didn't have to pay. So that was good if you're a kid with not a lot of money. And I would just go. It didn't matter. I would just pick one and I would walk around, and there wasn't any context for it. So I could there were things I liked. There were things I didn't like. There's things I now go back and look at that I loved when I was younger, and I'm terrible. Like, why did I like that? There's other things that I still love because I understand why I loved them then. And I think that there's something about all forms of art. Sometimes you like something and it's important to you and the person you are and the life you're living in a moment. It gives you solace. It helps you understand something. And then years later, it doesn't matter whether you still think it's good or it's bad or it's quality. There's an understanding of the way the artwork contributed something to your ability to be alive on this planet. And that is special. And as a scholar now, I think about that a lot because I can read a lot of theory and I can read history and I can do all kinds of theoretical things. But I try to remember that many people, when they're looking at art, that's not what they are coming with. It's that little thing in the image that holds you and gives you something, which is what art becomes meaningful to people's lives beyond all the ideas that as a scholar, then maybe I also try to share and to find the way in my writing, for example, to say like this little gesture here, this little light, this contrast, this thing, let your eye settle there. And then maybe something exploring can happen.
Do you have one special piece of art who like really is important for you? It's a big question, but
it's a huge question.
Yeah.
So it's funny. So there's works at different ages, right? I don't really like Renoir now, but when I was 11 and 12 years old, it was like, oh, it's so beautiful. Like, I don't know.
Color.
Yeah, right. Then I don't think there's one work. There's artists. Sometimes there's genres. I've always liked landscapes. I historically really did not like art with people in it.
Okay.
I just found there's people everywhere. There's people talking and doing and so when I would go to museums or like walk around galleries, I really liked landscapes because it felt space. Maybe because I was living in cities, right? I was always living in a city. And so I would imagine like walking through the trees or down the hill or imagining what was around the corner. And I think that was, for many years, really important to me. When I went away to college, I was studying philosophy and I became an artist's model. So all through the 4 years of college, I was studying philosophy, and then I would go sit for many different artists as both a nude and a clothed model, and sometimes talking to them, also thinking about being the model, made me start looking at works with humans in them maybe a little bit differently. And also thinking about that relationship that happens if it's with a model and the artist. You talk about things, you're thinking about things. There's a lot more going on than sometimes the conversation about models, especially the feminist conversation about models, expresses. I think that was a very influential time for me.
And when you study philosophy, did you know what you wanted to do? Like you wanted to be a teacher, a writer, or?
So I studied philosophy really because I just wanted to read from Plato forward. At the same time, I studied the history of mathematics from Euclid to post-Euclidean geometry. And that really informed sort of an understanding of how it is that the world, like the ideas that have helped shape our world. Then I wound up moving back to New York and thinking, I needed a job. You know, I had been engaged. I ended an engagement. I needed a job. I needed a place to live. I knew people in New York. And so I actually wound up getting a job for a publishing company that focused on ophthalmology and optometry, which is the medical study of the eye. And in that sense, I think it was important because I started maybe thinking about the eye, not from an artistic or creative perspective, but just from a very mundane and sort of boring, this person has glaucoma, like these people have cataracts, like, you know, this person has
scientist.
Like, it's like, what do you do, right? And thinking about how crazy the eye is. But I wasn't going to stay there forever. And so I went to graduate school. And I went to graduate school to write about Proust and how he writes about art. I was interested in why certain types of writing about art are not included in art history. So given how many people love Proust, given how many poems are about actual paintings and this kind of thing, why is this not a part of art history? Why is this not a part of the way we think about these works of art? Somehow that is not included in the discourse. And that seemed problematic to me because, of course, many people love these books and novels and poems about artworks. Like, that's what they read. They don't read art history. And so that's informing how they think about art overall. So why would art history cut that out? That's what I want to write about. Then things happened. I wound up getting very involved in surrealism, and the 1930s and the discourse between the surrealists and these, social realists and what happened between those two, sort of camps, if you will. The way the surrealists were very supportive of socialism and then actually went and saw some of what was happening, and many of them withdrew their support. I wound up writing my master's thesis on the manifesto that Breton wrote with Trotsky. And that started to change things for me. That's when I started to think about, how are we thinking about what we want art to be, what we're looking at. Anyway, then all of a sudden I started moving more and more into the contemporary. I wound up writing my dissertation about all of these poems, novels, a project at Tate Modern, there's some Proust, and really examining what happens when you disrupt the art historical discourse in this way. At the time in New York, there was a phrase everywhere because it was after 9/11. And it was, if you see something, say something. And one of the things that happened is very quickly, they started including photographs of a backpack, of someone wearing a hoodie, of a bag under a bench. Because we weren't teaching people to see for themselves and then to learn how to speak for themselves about what they see. with that phrase, what wound up happening is saying, these are the things we want you to see. We want you to see people in hoodies. We want you to see backpacks. We want you to see, right? It became the way in which these images told people what is danger, what is a threat.
What you said, it was the state who did a kind of campaign, or like how to new? Yeah, it was.
So it was on the everywhere in the subways and the metros. It was written on the steps. There were advertisements in subways, in all the airports, the train stations. It was in England too. They've since changed it, but so this was like everywhere. If you see something, say something. If you see something, say something. Except apparently not. If you see something, only if you see what I've told you to see.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And that worried me. It still worries me. I think it's been bad for education. I mean, there was such an incredible opportunity then to teach people how to visually interpret the world around them with the tools of the arts. Anyway, it didn't happen. But all of that got me involved in surveillance capitalism and surveillance culture and all of these artists doing work about surveillance and then doing projects around surveillance. And that was really what got me to the place where I started thinking about technology. Because artists were the ones who weren't just learning how to use it, but they were trying to figure out how to push the boundaries, how to push the edges, and therefore to let everybody else understand, what is this technology? How is it a part of your life? Where is it in the world around you? Are you okay with this? Is this what you want this technology to be doing? And that was me getting involved in image culture, emergent technologies, and I have been there ever since.
And how do you stay informed about new practices?
Initially, I was living in New York, so I had the advantage of lots of different artists and practices. I was interested in how some of these artists were using these technologies. The internet existed, so I could read their websites. I could see what they were doing. I could see what shows they were participating in. So I could then find out about other artists who were in those shows. So group shows are often very helpful because there will be the curator will have a concept and will present a body of work by many different artists, and I can sort of begin to think about it. I introduced myself to artists. I would write them and say, could I talk to you about your practice? I'm interested in this. What do you think about that? So because I'm interested in how artists will use technologies not in the right way. So, when I was thinking about virtual reality, for example, I was interested in when artists do abstraction in virtual reality, the obsession with realism and sort of perfect vision in virtual reality seemed less interesting to me than like abstraction. Like what if we do something different? Like why does it have to be that you are walking? Like you can skip, right? Like it's a complete sort of fantasy computer land. Like you don't have to do the things like gravity requires you do in this world. So there was that. And then, these are artists who themselves always want to check out the next thing. So then they're interested in photogrammetry, and then they're interested in, or get invited to participate in a beta version of a, image generator, like one of these AI things. Or then, I think, it was another artist who, I can't even remember now how, but I wound up talking to two of the women who had founded Dada, which was an NFT very early NFT platform. It was about collaborative drawing. And I spoke with them. And so I became curious about blockchain and how blockchain worked. That was 2018. So then I went to a conference in 2019 and learned more about blockchain, but there was also an art exhibition there, several artists who using blockchain in very interesting ways. And so then I learned about that. That's 2019. And then in 2021, suddenly everyone's interested in NFTs. And I'm not happy with the way the conversation's happening because they're ignoring these older practices, these art projects that are really intelligent and interesting and not just hype.
Yeah,
right?
buzz. Yeah.
And so, I'd been reading, obviously, this whole time. One is reading about artificial intelligence because it's a part of everything, like your autocorrect on your Microsoft Word, or Google is using it, filter bubbles, algorithms, like all of this is using AI in different ways. So when people talk now about like, oh, but, now AI is such a big thing, it's, well, actually, AI has been a big thing from different perspectives for a while. Like, by 2010, people were worried about filter bubbles and, algorithms. They were worried about data extraction architectures. So all these artists who were worried about data and data studies in, 2012, 13, like they were already interested in AI. So this is a very specific type of AI that's happening right now with the generators that people can use and make these images. But the conversation around AI has been happening for a while.
As you said, it's really new, but at the same time, it's new, like it's 20, 30 years old, all the technology, NI. But how do you gain perspective on your discipline? Like,
often I don't think it starts with the big picture. Often what winds up happening is I get very, very angry about something specific. I think, you read, I'll see a magazine article, or someone will ask me, I'll get the same question over and over again from friends or family or something who are not in the arts or something. And that, why do people think this? Like, why are they talking about it this way? This is ridiculous. And maybe it is because I spent my university years reading philosophy. I mean, reading, Plato still sits on my desk. Like, I have Plato's dialogues on my desk to this day. Even if I don't look at them every day, it's there, right? I've been thinking about Aristotle again in some ways. And also the way I read philosophy, it's not about it being right. It's not about it being correct. It's about people making an effort to think about the world they live in and explain what they are capable of explaining about it. And I think that model for me at, this early age of being like 18, 20 years old, right, is very important because it says what's important is to think about things. You might get it wrong, and then you'll write something else. You'll figure it out, And so part of it is that I think I think about everything all the time. Like it drives some of my friends and family crazy because I am always thinking about something. And I think right now it's very important to think about these things. Many people are trying to understand how it is we are in the world. Images, photography made a difference. Image culture before that made a difference. Now we're dealing with this just endless panoply of images constantly bombarding us, right? And I think it's hard sometimes to remember how new that is.
Mm.
We didn't used to see thousands of advertisements a day. Thousands. We see so many of them, we don't even recognize that we're seeing them. It's just a part of the background, right? But it's having an influence, right? We're still seeing it. It's how things become familiar. Brands, looks, aesthetics, styles, right? So we have this, sort of Western, history of image production and styles and aesthetics that produced one kind of, this is how you make good looking things, right? And then you have the 20th century, just every artist and every possible medium really trying to disrupt that, because they want to disrupt the canon. They want to disrupt the authority that had sort of appeared and risen up. And then you have the co-opting of that by marketing and advertising and capitalist culture and so forth. And so then, how is disruptive? Is how disruptive is it to be disruptive anymore? It's kind of, there you go. Look, someone's being disruptive again, right? So we're in this sort of challenging place now where it's like, is there a place for classicism?
You think so? Big question. I don't know.
It's a huge question. And I'm stepping back because, do I think that there's a place for classicism as in the ancient world, or neoclassicism, those aesthetics? Oh, I don't know. Do I think that people want to be able to rest their eye? I do. I think people want to be able to rest their eye. Do I think that there's a place for new aesthetics and new ways of talking about and discussing some of the new forms of image culture? Increasingly, I do. I haven't made up my mind, because I really believe in some of the, the forms, semiotics, formal analysis, thinking about images and some of the formal ways that have been a part of the last 500 years. And that's useful. I do it with these new technologies. But 25 years ago, people already started to recognize that there was a need for a different type of language to talk about how artists were constructing digital objects. And so Lev Manovich writes The Language of New Media. Various people have written about that since, and that's useful. It's useful to have these new terms. I think we're still figuring out, I'm still figuring out how to bridge, maybe, right? When I am looking at the work, so when we met at Paris Photo last year, right? I was looking at the work of Anna Ridler or Sophia Crespo, right? And they're interested in cyanotypes, and they're interested in some of these early forms of photography. But, they take, Anna took 10,000 images of tulips, like just photographs, one after the other, to produce the data set that would then allow her to make the AI work she wanted to do, right? Casey Rios right now has a show in London. He worked with a photographer who is very experienced in all sorts of wet lab practices, cyanotypes, tintypes, right? Like these early forms of photography. I think it's interesting that so many artists who have a commitment to using different types of AI tools are interested in this very early photography. Does that mean I need to bring the language of early photography to their work with AI? I don't know. What I wind up thinking about is, isn't it interesting that artists who are using this fairly new technology are looking at a very early form of photography? Why? Why are they doing that? Is it because on some fundamental level they realize this technology, GANs, generators, any of the sort of tools you can use that are themselves very new? So is there a sense of connection that they have to early photography, partly because that was so new and so unstable, right? Those early photographic practices require so much attention and care. And maybe there's a certain similar sensibility happening for these artists with these new technologies. I spoke with Casey Rios about this show. One of the things he was talking about was the way in which, when he's moving through the latent space, and he's trying to find the images that appeal to him, and he's moving through it, he was talking about it in this way, and maybe he was moving a bit because we were on camera. It was so embodied, the sense of like, just that sensibility. It's like, he's not looking at this and then this, right? It's this very fluid experience. It's a digital tool, but what he's talking about is an analog. It's not digital, right? And the way, if working in a wet lab, you learn the chemical bath. You learn how to flow. It's that thing you can't teach. You just have to make someone or do it over and over and over and over again until you have the body and the sense of the timing and the humidity that is beyond, I know it's this and this and this, right? It's
mechanical.
It's beyond the mechanical appreciation, right? It's like, it's just a sensibility. And so I think that that's interesting, right? So I'm curious about that because we're seeing a lot of it, right? So then I think, right, so you're asking me about like, how do you think about the big picture? It's like, that will be an example of like, oh, I see this and I see that and that. And like, well, that's interesting. Maybe it's because of this. And then I think, well, interesting. In fact, many people have been expressing an interest in craft, right? Many people it means so much when something is homemade, right? So many people I know started knitting and wanting to, make something that was by hand. Not just artists, right? Like everyday people, it started to become a special thing. More and more people will do things like say, I don't want to take pictures of it. Like, I just want to be here and have a coffee with you and not take photographs of it. Like, let's just allow ourselves that. There's a way in which maybe all of us are trying to figure out a new code of conduct, right? Is it a new manner of living? Because we are immersed. We have technology everywhere. I like it. I like having a map that tells me where I should go. I also like getting lost, like actually quite literally getting lost. I like not using a map and wandering around and sort of going down the wrong road and not knowing where I am. And
during the last century, it was analog to digital, and there is always, it's always this fight between the old and the new. Do you think like it's something really special, and we are in kind of new era?
I definitely think that algorithmic systems, I'm going to try and use a sort of broadish term there, have changed things. There's definitely something new. It's a new world, right? In that sense. Have these new technologies influenced photography? Well, absolutely. Because the thing is, when we got mobile devices, right? People refer to them as their phones, but they're not phones. Like, no one talks on the phone with them, really. Like, we text, we use maps, we're on apps, we're sending emails, right? Like, it's almost, I have days go by, I don't use it as a phone, right? So those mobile devices started allowing us to take so many photographs. So we started taking pictures everywhere, right? And then there are all these platforms that came up where people could post them: Tumblr, Flickr, Instagram, so on. And that started to happen. And so a certain type of aesthetic style, or I shouldn't say aesthetic, a certain set of styles appears, right? The selfie is the classic example, right? And so initially the selfie is quite ugly and people sort of are silly about it, and then people start to appreciate it. And it's quite interesting, actually. The selfie has a very mannerist thing about it, right? It's a sort of extended arm and long and weird and skinny in odd ways.
Yes, and the face is not,
The face is like, right? But we start to appreciate this new angle, right? And so does that do something to photography? Well, yes, because now photography has these is more okay with some of those angles and some of that approach and thinking, right? I'm thinking of Penelope Umbrico. She did these thousands of sunsets. So it's this work that she did where she went on to, I think it was originally Tumblr or Flickr. Unfortunately, I can't remember now. And she just took all these photographs people had posted of sunsets, and they all look the same, right? It's all the same. It's like, and she makes it into this massive digital wall. And so when it's shown, you just have these like endless images of the exact same sunset, right? So why are people taking a picture of that sunset? It's because they've seen other pictures of that sunset. That's a good sunset. And so then, people color correct to have the sunset in that way. So then, when she did that, she was sort of highlighting for people the way photography had normalized a set of image expectations for everyday people who aren't thinking about photography, who aren't thinking about photo theory, who aren't doing any of that, right? They're just taking a photo of a sunset because it's beautiful. Look at that nice sunset. Except they're doing it because of all this endless series of photographs that they've seen already online of sunsets. And I think we're going to, we keep seeing these sort of new, like, as technology allows you to do something with an image, and then people start posting it, and then it becomes normalized also in the more professional photography realm.
And they can say, I was here.
Yeah. And so I think there's no way, and part of it is, so many theorists have been thinking about this stuff, right? I mean, Fred Richin, who is just such a smart photo editor and has said such intelligent things about these new technologies, right? People were furious with him when they for the picture in Egypt where they brought the two pyramids closer together so it could fit in the cover image that they wanted, right? He was using Photoshop to do that, right? Travesty, terrible. You've destroyed the photo. we're so accustomed to the idea that photographs have these alterations now, right? That was this moment. Are we, right now, people are very upset about, like fakes, and rightly so, for political reasons. There's like lots of problems with them. But from an aesthetic perspective, like, is it maybe okay? Is it maybe interesting? Is there something to do there? Like, what is a fake in the context of art anyway? Well, that's thousands of years of discussing that.
I think the problem with the fake is when we don't know it's a fake. I think the problem is when we think it's a real picture and it's not, and when it's linked to a political subject or social. I think it's.
But these are the ethics of photojournalism, right? I mean, photojournalism is the one where they have to be very concerned about ethics, like, because. And lots of writing about this has happened, right? Like photojournalism itself, like you have to acknowledge, like they cut off the picture, like this is the part, they didn't take that, like, even when they had, all of the different slide images that you could look at, they would pick one from the contact sheet. Why not the other 49, right? Why not? So even there, choices are being made, right? And people have been concerned about this, debated it. I think, I can't remember if I mentioned it, but it was only 40 years ago that photography, not even yet digital photography, but photography itself, would people acknowledge that a photographer had style? It was perceived as impossible for a photographer to have style because it was all the camera. Style required the hand. It was the brushstroke. It was right. But Nigel Warburton, who's a philosopher of aesthetics, writes this essay saying, "Wait a minute, we understand the photographer's style not from a single photograph, but from a series." And when you look at a photographer's series of images, you start to get a sense of their style. You can identify the types of choices they like to make in terms of contrast and the rest of it. That was really huge for him to be able to posit that. And it provided a new way of understanding photography and thinking about what we're seeing. I find that very, very useful for thinking about some of these emergent technology images, right? I think it's almost fascinating to think about the fact that, like, if you use a public generator, right, what do you get for images, right? You get to pick 4 images. You get to pick one of them, and like you can keep dividing. But we're deep in the realm of series and sets, right? And that is something that photography has contributed to this discourse around all of these new sort of computational images. I don't feel like I answered your question now.
No, yeah. You answered. And looking ahead, what challenges do artists using the medium of photography face?
I think every artist faces challenges with any medium, right? Photography has always sort of struggled because I don't know why people want to beat up on photography so much, right? Like, it was destroying painting. Baudelaire thought it was terrible. And then, it's, it's not making enough of an effort. And then it's, fakes. And then now it's like, do we allow digital photography? Photography has a sort of pained, and I do not mean this about any particular photographer, but it's as if photography is just an incredibly neurotic art form, right? And maybe it's of an era. Maybe like neurosis is just something in the 19th century that we are still living with. But I think the challenge every artist has to ask now, with so many media at their disposal, in the context of the fact that many artists now are no longer just one medium, right? They're moving in and out of so many media. Why are you using the medium you're using? It's nice that you like to draw, but is drawing the best for the thing you want to do in this instance? Would it make sense instead for it to be a photograph? Because every medium does have a history, a set of politics, a set of social influences, styles, practices, and maybe part of what happened with contemporary art is a picture is never in a void. It exists with tentacles out into the past and the present, suggestive of futures. So at least, when I'm looking at any kind of artwork, and this includes photography, I'm thinking, why am I looking at this? What am I getting? Sounds so usurious, but what am I participating in? What am I being shown to understand, to feel, to worry, to appreciate? If it's a photograph, it's in the context of photography. And so I want to, I have to think about that. But even there, what kind of photograph? Right? Is it a C-type? Is it printed on aluminum? What am I dealing with? Why would those choices? I think that that's one of the hardest things that all artists right now are dealing with, because sometimes they just love making what they make. And that people like me are asking them, yes, but why why that? Why make it this way? Right? I'm thinking, just because of the Paris photo conversation, just sort of thinking about it, before I came here, it makes sense for artists and their projects to call upon a lineage of image production. And because that provides a context in which the viewer can start to find their way into whatever they're doing. In the same way that painting still exists, people still make oil paintings. Mm-hmm. Photography is going to continue to exist. That's not going to go away. I'm sort of baffled that people even worry about that. I worry more when, out of some sort of anxious, neurotic thing, an art practice like photography will not want to be in conversation with another one, like, say, these digital technologies, because that neurosis, it's unpleasant at a cocktail party when you're dealing with someone like that, right? Why not be in conversation with it, right? It makes sense for photography to be in conversation with oil painting, and it has been, right? It's also not. It's also done its own thing, right? Why not be in conversation with these and understand how some of what's happening with these technologies, whether it's using GANs, using public generators, photogrammetry, right? To be in conversation with sculpture, right? Photography was so important to sculpture. The way photography made sculpture, all the black and white images of sculptures that got reproduced in the 20th century in art history textbooks and so forth, it was really important that they be black and white images because it was part of the way in which people wanted to talk about sculpture, to talk about the way the sculpture itself would cast shadows and so on and so forth, right? So much of how we understand and think about sculpture comes from photography. So much of that conversation around sculpture has reappeared in the conversation about 3D models in computational spaces, right? We see some of those same anxieties when we're talking about photographs being produced by generators, the way the shadow hits and so on and so forth. It's all a conversation that comes out of the conversation around sculpture that was being had because of photographs. Photography is incredibly well situated to be able to point out those things and draw out those things. So photography as a discipline and as a history and in terms of its theories is really important. That being said, I am cautious when I'm dealing with works that artists make using, especially public generators, Midjourney, studies, all those, to not talk about them as photos. And I'm even sometimes worried about talking about them as pictures. I like to use the word image because I think it is more confusing for people to think about what's coming out, the output of these massive black box prompted systems, to think about that as a photograph. I think it's important to think about the text that goes into it, the vast sets of imagery, the data analytics, the tagging, the weird sort of, algorithmic, like connection, the statistical modeling. I think it's important that when we're dealing with those generators, that output, we want to talk about the output as if it's a single thing. But I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to do that. The prompt is a part of it. All of that statistical modeling is a part of it. And so the word image holds on to that confusion because so much theory 30 years ago about the image and recognizing that image is it's a word, metaphors, it's concepts. We have images in our heads where image is more than just the two-dimensional picture hanging on the wall. It is also that. But the word image moves in complicated ways across all this stuff. In the context of these generated images, I think image is a more important word to hold on to than photography or photo or even picture. I think we confuse people when we talk about those things purely as photography. But to not talk about photography in the context of how people are experiencing and think they should relate that affective I standing in front of something experience, well, that's silly. You have to talk about photography there. So that's confusing. How do we manage that for audiences and for people who are coming to this, right? When you have an exhibition and you're showing these generated images, people are going to engage with them, especially if they're printed, as if they are photographs. But I think it's important to hold the different process by which these images have been produced, especially in the context that many of the artists themselves are interested in that. They are interested in what is happening across the computer networked system. So, I don't know, we're figuring it out, right? We're trying to still figure out what the language is. We're trying to figure out what it's going to be. I don't think in the end we're going to be able to just talk about AI images. There's already, you have to distinguish.
But I think it's important to, as you said, to have all these questions in mind when we see an images or a photograph. I think it's important, yes, to have, and to not just look at the picture, without all the information, all the process. I think it's really important. My last question is, how do you manage to have the project between teaching and writing? And do you have some advice for people who want to become an expert in digital culture like yourself?
I mean, it helps if you like to read. I think Joanna Zielinska's recent book, The Perception Machine, is it's open access online from MIT Press. Like, I think that book, I disagree with some parts of it, right? But that's great. I mean, so the reason I mention that is because reading is a really important part of what I do, in part because reading is a community. I read, I see who they cite, who they're referencing, and now I have new people to think about. And they have other artists they're interested in and other practices. And so then I learn about other artists too, right? So of course, I'm a scholar. That's the academic side of me, right? I think that that's really important. But in terms of learning about this space, I think those types of texts really help start to help us think about it. I mean, I don't want to validate what so many of my friends say about me, but I'm a bit nuts. I mean, I want to write. I want to share ideas, and I want the artists that I think are amazing artists for people to know about them, to know about this work, especially because often, since I like ideas, I often like art that's fairly conceptual, that's sort of complicated, right? And so it can be hard initially to understand, like, what am I looking at? Like, it's not a person, it's not a tree, like, what is this, right? And I want to say, like, oh, let me take you there. Like, let me just write these couple sentences that will allow you to be like, okay, well, maybe I'm interested in that, right? Like, that's really important to me. I don't know why. And I try not to think too much about why I think it's so important to tell people about these art projects and these artists. Some of it is because I think deep in me, there's a very democratic strain. I don't believe in the hierarchy of the arts at all. From my perspective, it doesn't matter what medium you're doing. If you're making something that is great, like wonderful to look at or wonderful to think about, yes, right? I think life is short, and I have this incredibly lucky life. I get to be a university professor and to look at art and to read about ideas and to write about it in a part of the world that is safe. For me as a woman, for me as just a human being, like, that's extraordinary. And so I have some sense of the fact that, like, do something with that, like, share, contribute, be a positive contributor to the world. And don't let the crap win, right? Like, somehow find space for beauty, right? Beautiful ideas, beautiful experiences. And that means that sometimes I am not. Like I get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, and I exercise, I stretch, I have different things that I do. I drink a lot of caffeine. I drink yerba mate. Sometimes I have coffee. I drink caffeinated water. I have I really love caffeine. Okay. Like I have caffeine all day long. This works for me. I know other people it doesn't work. I eat the same thing almost every day. Different seasons, different things. But like when it becomes spring, this is what I start to eat. And I order the same groceries every week. I order the same, because when I'm thinking and when I'm writing, I can't be bothered by other types of new sensibility experiences. It needs to be, predictable. Because I'm thinking about things and I'm looking at art that isn't that's my guess. I don't actually know why. It's just the way I am. I sort of have a uniform. I kind of wear the same thing every day, except seasonal. It changes a little bit, right? And then I let it be. Like I get lost. I don't really care. I get lost. There's things then you have to just not care. Like I forget to send birthday cards to people that I love. I'm just bad at that. And so I try and let them know how much I love them in other ways, because when I'm really involved in reading and writing and thinking and looking at art, other things.
Yeah, it's really intense.
Yeah.
And the rest is needs to be organized.
Yeah. I'm not good at when I need to look at art and think about it, I'm not good at being with other people. If I can look at it casually and just be enjoying myself, and then I can be with other people. But it's if it's work, if I'm looking, then I need to be by myself. So I spend a lot of time by myself.
And you think it's when you ask to some students, or do you think it's important to be?
So one of my favorite exercises to give students is to select a work of art that they can go look at in person. It's very important. Doesn't matter if it's like a public monument or in a museum. It needs to be, I hate to say this, but it does need to be a great work of art, right? Like it needs to be a work of art that has enough people have been like, there's a lot here. And then to have them go look at it twice a week for an hour, for at least a month, if not 2 months. Same work, over and over again. I think it's important to get bored by the work. I think it's important to learn how to free associate with the work. I think it's important to notice how you start to see different things based on your mood. Over 2 months, the season will probably change. The air quality will change. The wind, the light will change. So you'll also experience how the world that you live in changes how you see the work, even if the work is indoors.
Yeah, and the people can also change if, when we are not the same.
Yeah. And
if you're hungry, if you're bored, tired,
if you've had your heart broken, if you're stressed about family, if it was raining outside, all these things. And so I think that experience, we don't do that anymore. It's very rare, right? And so and it's boring. Like students always say that it's so boring. I don't want to do this, right? It's like, right. Like just sit there. Can I take notes? Sure, take notes. Take notes on what you're thinking about, right? Keep looking.
Keep looking.
Keep looking.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we will end with this sentence. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for your time, and see you maybe next in Paris Photo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Les Voix de la Photo. In the notes of this episode, you will find a sign-up link to receive Les Voix de la Photo newsletter. Sorry, it's in French, at least for now. Every 2 weeks, you will get a summary of the latest episode, exclusive content, my recommendation for reading, exhibitions, or conferences, and sometimes even gifts. Also, to help spread the word about the podcast, I'll invite you to leave a comment and 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to share your thoughts, suggest people you would like to hear, or learn more, you can follow me on social media, on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. See you soon!